but welcome to our test optionals, does it really work debate. I am Kevin Organichek. I am the founder of the Association for Test Preparation, Admissions, and Private Tutoring. We are a consortium of independent and local test prep and tutoring companies. We provide professional development, continuing education, and standardized SAT, ACT instructor training to our members. I'm very pleased to be welcoming three people today, as well as the audience, but Bob Schaeffer of Fair Test, Matt Larriva of Powerful Prep, and Bob Verini, our esteemed moderator. Before we begin, I need to read this disclaimer. So we are, as I said, an association of tutoring companies and professional tutors and independent educational consultants. We believe wholeheartedly in the idea of the academic meritocracy, and with that comes the belief that standardized testing is needed. We acknowledge that there are weaknesses in current standardized testing. However, we believe that the right course of action is to improve the tests and increase access to those tests and to preparation for those tests. So before we get into the debate, I just want to let you know that you can put your remarks in the chat box. And if you have a question to ask either of our principals, you can do so there as well. Time permitting, we will take a couple of audience questions at the end. So without further ado, I want to introduce the smartest guy I know, Bob Verini. Bob is an admissions advisor, a former Jeopardy champion, an instructional designer, and a learning science specialist. So Bob, thank you for being our moderator, and take it away.
My pleasure. Thank you and welcome everybody. Our panelists today are each going to be presenting a 5-minute sort of opening statement, after which I will present, alternating between them, a set of questions. Each will have 2 minutes to react to the question in order. Then I'll offer each guest in turn a minute to follow up, and that's the format you see on the slide there. Along the way, and Matt and Bob know this, I will discreetly, if I can, slip in a 10-second warning should that be needed. If time permits, we want to take some audience questions. So I want to reiterate what Kevin was saying about if you have questions for our panelists together or separately, please put those into the chat. Okay, that I think covers the rules. Our panelists flipped a coin yesterday to determine that I would first introduce Matthew Larriva, founder of Powerful Prep, a leading concierge tutoring firm dedicated to transparency, massive point gains, and customized curriculum. His opinions have been featured in the LA Times and the Wall Street Journal, and on USA Today and Yahoo News. And he was named an elite super tutor by the BBC. Matt has published 3 books on test preparation and numerous articles at his blog, which is powerfulprep.com/blog. He's one of the most read writers on Quora with nearly 1.5 million views. Matt Larriva holds an undergraduate degree from the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania and has a master's in applied statistics from UCLA. Matt, welcome, and the floor is yours for a 5-minute opening statement.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. I'm gonna start by sharing my screen, and thank you to everybody for being here today. Okay, actually, I'm going to share a different screen. I'm going to share this one. And Bob, can you confirm you can see it? Okay, great.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed, I can.
All right, perfect. So I'll jump right in. Thanks for the introduction, Bob. And I want to start by saying that I believe Bob from Fair Test and I have basically the same target future in mind. We want students to have access to high quality education regardless of background. And As educators, I think everyone in the audience would agree with that. But as educators, we also have to rely on evidence to guide teaching. And unfortunately, all the evidence we have shows that the test optional trend is failing at its mission, and it's doing so at the expense of students. And worse still, it's hiding evidence of the truth about our weak education system, and it's silencing an alarm that we all need to be listening to. Because the truth is, we are failing at education in this country. Compared to other nations, we're weak and we've made no substantial gains in the last 20 years. So we're failing categorically, and we don't even really have a good sense of this because we have to rely on these rarely done, underrepresented, underreported metrics to tell us, because most of the metrics we commonly see are disguising this fact. GPAs are lying about this because they're inflating so rapidly. For the last 20 years, the most common grade has been an A. So GPAs aren't really telling us the truth about this fact. And on the statewide assessment level, we're also not getting a clear picture. Scores on the state administered, state developed tests go up nice and linearly. But meanwhile, according to the National Association of Educational Performance, only 30% of California students are proficient at math or reading. And I want to thank Dave Carey, who's an educational researcher, for bringing this to my attention. So as a result of this, you get a trickle-down effect, and then you get this artificial spike in graduation rates that perpetuate this lie about the true education our students are receiving. And these are surging because GPAs are surging, yet these students are as undereducated as ever. And so what do you look to for a student's true capabilities if our education system is working? What tells you that? What metric doesn't inflate? SAT and ACT scores. They show evidence of the reality, which is that we're not getting better. There's sort of this smoke detector telling us that there's danger, but Fair Test would rather take the batteries out of the smoke detector than find the fire. But they do more than just report on the state of education. They actually help colleges make better decisions. The research tells us that GPA and SAT scores, ACT scores as well, combined predict college success better than GPA alone. And you can understand why when you realize that GPAs are so inflated that 1 in 4 of Boston's high school valedictorians failed to graduate college in 6 years. And here I want to transition and talk about the real personal and negative effects of removing these tests, which is that the students suffer. And how do we know this? We look at the studies. We look at peer-reviewed research studies over the last 10 years. We don't look at stories. We don't look at anecdotal evidence about one school's path one time. We look at these studies and we see that students are harmed, either because there is no significant effect on diversity or student quality, or because test optional policies enhance perceived selectivity rather than diversity, meaning a school goes test optional. Students take that to mean that it's easier, apply more, but the school doesn't have more seats, so it rejects more people. It therefore increases its ranking because it looks like it's more selective, and no one wins. Furthermore, we see that graduates admitted under test optional policies have to borrow more than those who are required to submit their scores. Exactly the opposite of what this policy was intended to do. And if that weren't bad enough, I want to close with what's happened in the last 2 decades since test optional has picked up steam. In 2000, we had about 16 test optional schools. And in 2010, there's about 78, but there are a large number of sort of fringe schools, for-profit schools, et cetera. Meanwhile,
10 seconds, Matt.
Enrollment in colleges is spiking at that time. Then you get to a period where test optionality is more prolific and the numbers decrease categorically. So it's not the fault of test optional trend, but you certainly can't say that it's working.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Matt. It is now my pleasure to introduce Robert A. Schaeffer, Executive Director of Fair Test, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, for which he previously served as Public Education Director. He has been Research Director of the Massachusetts Legislature's Joint Committee on Human Services, and he contributed to the 2020 publication by Teachers College Press of The Scandal of Standardized Tests, Why We Need to Drop the SAT. The co-author of numerous fair test publications, including Standing Up to the SAT and the SAT Coaching Cover-Up, Bob has been quoted many times in trade publications and major media outlets, including the New York Times and Washington Post. Bob Schaeffer earned his undergraduate and graduate degrees at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Bob, welcome. The floor is now yours for a 5-minute opening.
Thank you, Bob. We appreciate the opportunity, and thank you to PTA-PT for this opportunity to talk to the larger group. I'll save my responses to Matt's string of cherry-picked anecdotes, hyperbole, outright falsehoods, and post hoc, copter hoc arguments to the rebuttal period, and do the initial presentation that I was asked to produce, and then we can come back to the other points later on. And just to recognize that test optional is not something new in the screen is not working. Hang on. The screen just froze. It's interesting.
Bob, do you want to jump out and jump back in and see if that?
Yeah, just everything froze here. I'm not sure what the problem is, guys.
All right, so jump out and jump back in, okay?
Okay.
The fates have spoken.
I've stopped the clock.
That's okay. I'm sorry for that, folks. I do lots of these and have never had that problem previously. And it won't even shut down. Interrupted is that test optional admissions is nothing new. Before the pandemic, there were 1,070 accredited four-year institutions, including things like the University of Chicago, Wake Forest, Bates, Bowdoin, American, George Washington were test optional. 360 schools ranked in the top tiers, not some isolated unknown schools as Matt would suggest. More than half of the top 100 liberal arts colleges were test optional by that time, about a quarter of national universities. The test optional movement was growing very rapidly pre-COVID. Since the previous redesign of the SAT, 175 more schools went test optional, including 51 in 2019, the most any year ever, and big name colleges, regional colleges, et cetera. In terms of data and evidence, you can cherry pick flawed studies, or you can look at the full record. Huge book done a number of years ago, the second one here, Crossing the Finish Line, Completing Colleges in America's Public Universities, done by the presidents of Harvard and Spencer Foundation, concluded that high school grades are a far better predictor of graduation rates than our test scores. Heavy reliance on ACT, SAT scores can have a negative impact on diversity, and the strong predictive power of a high school GPA he holds even when we know nothing about the quality. And then we have a number of peer-reviewed studies and others done by individual institutions. The publication at the top of the page, Defining Excess, How Test Optional Works, is one of several done by the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, summarizing data from a number of their member schools, 28 institutions, 950,000 applicants, near universal increase in applicants, boost in underrepresented minorities and Pell grantees. And by the way, unlike the studies Kevin cites, this one actually looked at schools who were really test optional. The one most cited by critics counted Eckhart as a test optional school 4 years before it was test optional. And considering that stuff like that is not valid research. So with the pandemic, as you all know, hundreds more schools went test optional, all the name brands, every public system except Florida, and 560 admissions leaders signed an ACT statement that test optional means test optional. Right now, 1,740 some schools, 3/4 of all four-year schools are test optional for next fall. Nearly all the top 100 liberal arts colleges, only exception I think is the Naval Academy. Almost all of the national universities, the exceptions being the University of Florida system and the University of Georgia system. And more than half of all four-year institutions are now permanently test optional or test blind, meaning that they will be test optional for 2023 and beyond. And schools are extending it to the to financial aid. Why test optional? The studies show, not the cherry-picked isolated studies, but the vast majority of studies and the data from this year. More applicants, academically stronger applicants, more diversity of all sorts. Here, for example, are the University of California numbers just published from the 2 years that they have been test blind. And as you can see, increases in all the categories, increase in total number of MITs to be sure, but the increases of percentages as well from going test optional. Why test optional? Kids love it. The Common App data released this month indicated that only 43% of all Common App users submitted test scores. That was an increase of about 43%. 43% submitted test scores this year, 77% did last year. And the number of Black students who submitted test scores was 31%. So it is particularly appealing to historically disenfranchised groups. From the admissions side, there's a lot of data. Our own book, the Scandal of Standardized Tests, summarized this, published by Teachers College Press, unfortunately at the beginning of the pandemic. But there's tons of data out there.
About 10 seconds, Bob.
And I will wrap up because that gets me to the slides that I was going to use for the end. Yeah, I think this is a case of what are you going to believe? A couple isolated studies or your own lying eyes? 1,700 schools are test optional. It's worked, it's fair, it's effective. Thank you. And thanks for the patience.
Okay. So now we move into the 2-minute question period. That is to remind everybody, or for those who came in later, we have some questions prepared. We're going to alternately offer them to our panelists. Each will have 2 minutes to respond, and then each will have a minute to respond to the response, or I guess rebut, if you like. And Bob, the first question is yours for 2 minutes. What was it? Was it a particular instance or personal experience? What was it that led you to your position on testing? Was there some sort of road to Damascus moment that you can point to?
Great question. No, I was always a great test taker. Viewed them as an interesting game and got top scores, national merit finalists, and all that stuff. Didn't even think about it till I was in college and after college working at the MIT Education Research Center with a previous generation of test critics who opened my mind to how they were poor measures that essentially measured test-taking skills, not the types of things you need to succeed in college. And then at MIT, we launched an experimental college within a college where we simultaneously had students who matriculated at MIT, Tufts, UMass Boston, and North Shore Community College. Huge differences in test scores. And you couldn't tell necessarily in the educational setting which of those kids has the best academic talent. And then my own son, a decent test taker, but not a great one, wanted to go to a more competitive college, and we paid one of the big test prep companies probably $500. His scores went up 150 points. And as a result, one of his safety schools offered him $3,000 more a year in so-called merit. Test scores don't measure merit, but that's what they called it, aid. So our investment of $500 would have yielded $12,000. And that is clearly unfair way the system is skewed to upper middle class affluent families.
Okay, Matt, you're up. Same question about your road to Damascus moment.
Sure.
If you're asking me what one event happened that made it feel like test optional was useless, I would sort of reject the premise. It's like asking what one event happened that made you think the Earth is round. It's like, I presume that the Earth is round until you prove otherwise. I assume that policies that are done in the name of altruism, but with zero forethought and a complete disregard for feedback, are going to be useless until I hear otherwise. And I have not heard otherwise per any of the research. If you're asking instead why I believe test optional has failed, I'd say that's obvious. It's empirically observable by our lying eyes. It's rigorously studied using peer review methods, and it's widely agreed upon by a number of experts in the field. So I don't really think that there's sort of an epiphanic moment that made me sort of come to my senses.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Bob, a minute for you to fire back.
Matt keeps referring to expert in the field and cites the same one or two dissenting studies. There are 1,740 institutions that have determined that test optional admissions, at least in the current situation, makes sense. Are you more expert than those admissions offices who have made those studies based on the data from their own schools and from their peer institutions? I'm not sure why anyone would be so arrogant as to believe that their personal views override that of the rest of the profession, unless, of course, you believe that admissions officers are all liars.
Matt, last word for you on this.
Sure. So first, to Bob's opening statements, all the studies that he cited were from books, which have no peer review process to them. One was blatantly not peer reviewed. The other was from a book called Ever the Leader. The other was from Teachers College Press. I also would reject the notion that 1,700 schools are test optional out of choice. They did so because of the pandemic, and they've not relied on any data to do so themselves.
Okay. Switching gears, Matt, we start with you, please. If parents or people, others in the field, were interested in the topic of test optional, what articles or books or studies ought they to usefully consult, and what should they look for?
Sure. So I would go to peer-reviewed research. You can find this on Google Scholar, and you can find that it's been peer-reviewed because it'll show up in a journal. So I can do this for the remainder of the time. 2021, Bennett published a study, untested admissions in the American Research Journal. They found a modest 1 percentage point increase in absolute share of increase of underrepresented minorities. 2020's Beavers and Mulholland in SSRN, applicants who forego submitting standardized test scores signal that they have fewer enrollment options. 2019, Matt Sabo and Sabrina Tarazi in SAT optional policies in economic letters. Test optional policies have very limited effects. The only statistically significant effect you found is a brief increase in the number of applicants in response to a new policy. 2018, Hiss and Franks in the title Measuring Success in the JHU Press. When given the option, first generation college students choose to not submit scores more frequently, but they find no increase in attendance to schools. 2017, J. Futura, Sociology of Education in Stanford. Findings also suggest that economic or prestige-driven motives, especially related to a school's yield rate, influence schools to adopt a test optional policy. 2016, more information, more informed decision, why test optional policies do not benefit institutions or students. The most pervasive in the meta study, 2015, Velasco and Rosinger from Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. Enrollment among students of color doesn't increase in response to these policies. It cites a University of Georgia study, 180 selective liberal arts colleges, no statistical difference in enrollment. And that report obviously made people mad because it brought up the point, then why do schools do it? Because it increases their rankings, because it makes their selectivity look higher.
10 seconds.
That's all.
Okay. Bob, 2 minutes for you.
Yeah, where to begin? The latter study he cited is the one that counted schools as test optional when they were not. Paul, saying that books and the history of books that criticize the SAT go back to about the 1990s, the case against the SAT by the University of Chicago Press, by the way, reviewed. This is Crossing the Finish Line the book that cited the data from the ACT primarily in public universities. There is a wealth of studies, and to suggest that colleges are doing it for reasons like increasing their rankings, that is a total falsehood. The chief rankster at Bob of US News, Bob Morse, has said he has looked at the data, Fairtest has looked at the data. That doesn't happen. You should not be making up arguments, Matt, to defend a position that is totally out of sync with what's going on in the admissions profession. Those people who are institutional researchers and heads of enrollment do thorough, careful research before they adopt policies. 1,070 were test optional pre-pandemic. They didn't do it out of whim. They didn't do it for rankings. They did it because their data and their mission said it was a better policy. And the fact that you can cite a handful of contradictory and often flawed studies doesn't change that reality. Test optional admissions is the new normal.
Matt, a minute for you to respond.
Yeah, I don't have a contrarian view that it's the new normal, but I think we should look past what's popular and try and ask ourselves if this is appropriate. I've not seen, nor have any of the studies, one from every year, which is pretty pervasive. They haven't found that either. Numerous admissions officers at Dartmouth and Penn have said it's a blatant publicity stunt.
Name the admissions officer.
I'm not sure what your position of chief rankster at US News and World is, so can't respond to that one.
Bob, go ahead.
The chief admissions officer at Penn, Whitney Sewell, who has been on panels with Fairtest promoting test optional admissions, previously worked at Bowdoin, who has been test optional for only 51 years. Who previously worked at Connecticut, which has been test optional for 20 years, and previously at Bates, which was test optional for 35 years. You're correct that a test prep person who previously had a connection claims that test optional doesn't work, a connection to Penn. But as Upton Sinclair has often said, it's difficult to get someone to understand the reality when their salary depends on denying that reality.
Okay, getting away from studies for a moment to the practical realities around the kitchen table or whatever. And Bob, we'll start with you here.
Thank you.
It's high application season now. What should parents or applicants do? What should they know if they're on the fence about test optional admissions or indeed don't know much about it?
One, they should know that the vast majority of colleges and universities are test optional for 2022. Two, they should know that admissions decision makers adopted that policy for good reasons based on experience, data, and mission. Thirdly, they need to know that test optional gives they and their children a powerful choice to determine the best foot to put forward. And if they seriously believe that filling in bubbles on a Saturday morning, which by the way, is not merit, is not educational merit, it's test taking skill. If they believe that that helps, they have the power to use them. But as we've seen from the Common App in the past year, the vast majority of students chose not to send in test scores because they did not think that it materially added or helped their application. It's an individual choice matter for families, and test optional admissions gives them that choice.
Okay, Matt, 2 minutes for you.
Yeah, I'm as confused as parents are because schools have categorically provided zero evidence on what they mean by optional. What does it really mean to have an optional score submission policy? Who is that intended for? What does the environment look like now? So I would encourage them to really figure out, contact the schools and ask who they expected and didn't expect scores from. Because if we have to rely on the school's actions to dictate this, then we have to go off of schools like UPenn and Georgetown, who were test optional, but admitted 90 and 75% of their classes respectively who submitted scores. So here you are under this banner that submit a score, don't submit a score. We don't care. We look at you holistically, only then to be duped and rejected categorically if you didn't submit one. So I don't know how this sort of policy is being implemented. And I wouldn't expect that students or parents do either. So I would counsel them to really try and get clarity from an admissions officer on what's going on here, because they haven't made it clear to us.
Okay, Bob, a minute to come back.
I mean, Matt is right that the policies differ by some degree, but once again, he's cherry picking outliers and citing Georgetown, which was the most grudging school in the country to adopt test optional admissions for 2021 and has restored its testing requirement for 2022. Instead of the, Georgetown, why don't we look at any of the Ivy League schools, Chicago, or any other highly selective, and you will see that those are schools that have signed the NACAC pledge that test optional means test optional.
Matt, one more from you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times we're going to hear that more schools are doing it. There's no debate. More schools are going test optional because test centers were closed the last year and students couldn't submit scores. The fact that they've all signed a pledge is meaningless. And we can see this because it's happened 10 years ago when they all signed Harvard's Turning the Tide pledge to evaluate students more holistically, and then nothing changed. We know from experience that schools are very excited to do things that look aesthetically pleasing, but they don't really need anything to back it up.
Okay. Next question goes to Matt first. Is there anything that could happen or anything that could be revealed that could conceivably make you reconsider your position on test optional and maybe even change it altogether?
Yeah, I'd say absolutely. Churchill said, when the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do? I mean, I don't have a religious position here. I have a research-backed one. If you show me evidence that school districts are looking at some other objective test and using it to improve their school curriculum, and that's a successful feedback loop, I'd be thrilled. I'd be saying, great, we're using some other tests and we're figuring out how to make this education process better. Some schools are starting to use SATs and ACTs as exit exams because they found more merit in those. But most states are not. And separately, if you showed me any non-anecdotal evidence, something where somebody wasn't just opining or writing an article in an op-ed or something that was peer-reviewed, that was really consistent, that said this policy was actually working as intended, and examine the negative consequences of it, that would be really enlightening. But we don't have that, and blaming the test doesn't really help anyone. But it does get us in a weird position where you accuse these tests of cultural bias, and then it co-opts the argument into a strange place entirely. So I would be happy to change my mind. I would be happy if there was something here at play that were actually helping students and that we saw evidence to that effect. And if someone independent of my position or Bob's position, obviously, did the research and consistently found what I've seen them find, which is that these policies are more harmful than they are helpful. But yeah, I mean, I'd change my mind in the face of evidence.
Okay, Bob, 2 minutes for you, same question.
Well, certainly if there were independent studies showing that test optional admissions did not live up to its promises of improving diversity without undermining educational quality, we would change our mind. Matt's selectivity is amazing, that small studies in obscure journals matter. Books like this one, published by the Crossing the Finish Line by the Princeton University Press, The Case Against the SAT by the University of Chicago Press, or our book by Teachers College Press, they don't count in Matt's cosmology, perhaps because they disagree with his minority opinion. The notion that admissions offices have made these decisions based on trying to look better in a popularity contest. The University of Chicago, a top-tier school in world rankings, didn't need to go test optional. Their own internal studies said that it would be fairer and better and produce more diverse classes. You know, we're assuming that all these people in these colleges have either bad motivations or incompetent researchers, and that people like Matt are the only holders of this truth. And that's not correct. You're in the minority. It's a flat earth position.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
Bob,
Matt.
despite your 2 MIT degrees, I think you're holding up something to your screen that's not turned on. I think it was a book, and I think you were saying that I said books are worthless. They're not, right? But they're not peer reviewed. So there is an issue of independence, right? If you as an author publish something without peer review, there's a lot of opportunity for bias. I certainly don't suppose that I'm the only holder of truth. I'm just somebody who goes on Google Scholar and looks for peer-reviewed research and has found one a year for the last 10 years, showing that this policy isn't really helpful, but there's a handful of ulterior motives to it.
Bob?
Well, once again, you're questioning the credibility and competence of professionals in university admissions and assuming that your experience as a test prep and Jeopardy star, it gives you superior knowledge of what goes on in those halls. I've done panels with probably 50 admissions directors. Gonna have 3 more on our panel at NACAC next week from Cornell and Jacksonville and Marquette. I've seen their data. They know what they're doing. They know why they're doing it. It's not for some ulterior motives. It's because they know from the numbers and from their own school's mission that test optional admissions is a superior way to maintain academic quality and open the door of colleges by removing one impediment, not all of them, to equal opportunity.
One thing I'll just step in and clarify, it's not Matt who's the Jeopardy star, that's me.
Sorry.
It was a long time ago, but I'm still proud of it. No, that's all right, I'm just teasing. But I just wanted to just clarify that particular fact. Bob, here's a kind of a broad question for you, although these issues have come up quite a bit since we began. Some of the hot button issues that both of you or each of you has raised, things like grade inflation and so-called educational elitism. To what extent are these legitimate concerns in terms of both public policy and how parents should be involved in assessing test optional?
Well, first of all, grade inflation. Grade inflation is real. So is test score inflation. The test makers themselves and independent researchers like Adam Ingersoll, who I saw was on, and my colleague Akil Bello have tracked over time the sharp growth in number of kids who score 35 to 36s on the ACT and 1550 and above the SAT. And that's because of the competent work done by many of the companies who are represented on this call. Test scores, to the extent they were ever a good predictor, have been undermined by the effectiveness of test prep. Even the College Board now admits that test prep raises scores by 150 points if you spend enough time doing it. So it's the notion that tests are objective, fair, a level playing field, or as the College Board used to say, a common yardstick. Yeah, it's true, as long as they're made out of silly putty.
Matt, 2 minutes.
You're muted, Matt.
You're muted, Matt.
Thanks. Grade inflation as it relates to the SAT and ACT is just another reason why the studies are showing us that SAT scores combined with GPA end up providing superior metrics of college performance than GPA alone. So we know that grades are inflating, but grades by and large have a much nearer ceiling. So grades are inflating, and once they hit A, they can't go any higher. And you can say the same of SAT and ACT scores, but their ceiling is much farther. They're generally bell curve. So yes, there are certainly more 36 scorers, but we're talking about like 10,000 people a year versus 5,000. So we're not really concerned that they're becoming a false metric. These scores are wandering by like 5 to 10 points a year, but the tails are getting a little bit fatter, that's for sure. Your other question was about educational elitism. I'm not sure where that's going, but you could say that elitism would be that only people whose parents have been educated are getting good educations. And that's very true in this country, but that's independent of the SAT or ACT. That's a more systemic change that we really need to address.
Okay. Bob, a minute to respond.
Well, if you want to look at data, look at the data from the University of California Office for the President, Saul Geiser's studies over the last 20 years, looking at the value of SAT and ACT scores in predicting undergraduate success in the UC system. He finds that test scores are a great predictor of parental affluence, and that, in fact, that's what they're measuring. And once you discount that in your predictive equation, test scores are not very helpful at all. You recall that we used that data and others from many studies in the lawsuit that was brought by public counsel against the University of California Regents, which forced them to eliminate test scores in their admissions process. That was peer-reviewed by a judge based on tons of data submitted by both sides. And he decided the preponderance of the evidence indicated that relying on the ACT and SAT created an unfair barrier to access to disabled students and minorities and low-income applicants.
Matt, 1 minute for you.
Yep. Somehow we've wandered over to the UC decisions. So sure, we can talk about that. The UC did a year-long study with 25 of its own professors into the use of standardized testing. And what they found was that they did not recommend the UCs to make standardized testing optional for applicants. And they said that any change would require doing something that they didn't know how to do and could conceivably result in greater inequalities and worse student outcomes, particularly if changes were made immediately and without adequate consultation. So that study didn't really do it for me. Your comment about peer reviewed by a judge, that's not an academic peer reviewed listing. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, Matt, for the next question is kind of broad, but I think it's to sort of allow both of you to sort of take it where you want to. Racial bias, ethnic bias, gender bias, racial, gender, ethnic issues. To what extent do they figure in this whole debate, in this whole test optional issue, and to what extent should they do so?
I don't think they should have any mention in this debate. I think it's a quaint premise to reduce the problem of systematic racism to a test score. And I think it's reproachable that Fair Test has somewhat co-opted the legitimate ethnic bias that exists in the US and tied their message to that cause. And it's sort of reductive to the complexities of the problem. So, I mean, conversely, I wish I lived in a world where that was so simple and causally connected that you could fix these deep endemic biases of our society by making a 3-hour test optional. But that's not the case, and that's not the world we're in. So I'll come back and say that the SAT and ACT are not biased, but our education system really is. And that's an issue that we need to address at a systemic level. But that's a really hard problem to fix, and we don't have good solutions to it. And those that we do are really not glamorous. So it's easier for Fair Test to kind of tilt at windmills and call them giants rather than address a systemic issue. There's a really good quote from a female Black parent who is fairly high in the community, said, it's published, "I'm here to unequivocally state that SATs and ACTs are not racist, and any statement otherwise is statistically and logically false. And the truth as to why there's a gap can be found by looking at the interplays of various forms of marginalization." I mean, we know that students across the country are failing to meet federal testing benchmarks, and we know that Black and brown populations are those most likely to go to underfunded high schools. And I wonder if that has anything to do with their scores. I wonder if that's a more plausible explanation than some racism that we believe to exist in a test.
Yeah. Bob, 2 minutes for you, same issue.
And no one has ever claimed that going test optional was a cure-all, a silver bullet for the systematic biases that exist in American society or in education or in college admissions process. But going test optional does remove one brick from the wall. Specifically, gender bias is the most clearly demonstrated flaw of the test. Even the test makers agree that it's there. They don't understand why, but young women still get slower scores on the SAT, but outperform their male counterparts when matched for the identical courses in college. So either all the college professors are biased in favor of women, or maybe there's something wrong with the test. In terms of racial and socioeconomic bias, there is ample evidence that these tests are skewed, that there's a strong correlation between test scores and family income, test scores and race. The fact that you can cite one African-American woman who stands up for test scores does not negate the fact that Fair Test has been joined in litigation against these testing requirements by groups like the Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund and the NAACP and the National Urban League, who I think represent more than the one woman whose views you cited. It's, again, you can cherry pick data, or you can look at it holistically. And the overwhelming body of evidence demonstrates that test optional admissions creates a more level playing field and allows students who would have been otherwise excluded to show their stuff and succeed in higher education.
Okay. Matt, 1 minute to come back.
Yeah, it's such a shame then that despite this test optional policy that is removing a brick in the wall, since it's really come into its heyday, the enrollment of Black people has gone down versus a sharp increase in the decades prior to this test optional movement. And that's also said of American Indians and Pacific Islanders and Asian people. And even the increase that Hispanics were seeing really tapered down since test optional came into its stride. So despite their litigious efforts, it's an ineffective strategy.
You know, Matt, I've heard the equivalent of that post hoc propter hoc argument before. When I was in school in Cambridge, people claimed that the reason leaves fell off the trees in Cambridge in September and October is because students came back and went to and enrolled in school. There's no causality. The primary reason that the number of African Americans and perhaps Native Americans has declined is economic. The cost of college has gone up astronomically in many cases, and poverty has grown significantly in this country. You know, arguments like that don't help advance the cause that we should still have test scores. They create barriers to access, which school after school has found that you remove the barrier and you get more diversity, you get better qualified applicants, and you get more applicants. That's why schools continue to go test optional. That's why so many are committed to test optional policies post-pandemic.
Okay, next question, Bob, for you, and you may have touched on this, but I think it opens a new door. Up till now, in your view, have colleges responded appropriately to the use of test optional admissions, and what could they do to respond better?
Many have responded appropriately by doing what Fair Test and our academic allies have urged them to do, which is first do internal studies to see how predictive these test scores really are. Don't rely on the research done by people with a self-interest, either from the testing companies or other promoters of test prep progress, but look at the numbers at that particular school. They've also done a reasonably good job of tracking the data from going test optional. Fair Test has urged them to follow the Bates model, and Bates went test optional in 1985, of regularly collecting and reporting data on the performance of students submitters versus non-submitters, to see such things as grade point average, retention rates, graduation rates, honors, going to graduate school, et cetera, and making that data public. It's important for parents, for applicants, and for other schools. Where they have not yet come up to our standard, and we did a panel on this at the last pre-pandemic NACAC conference, is in removing test score hurdles from financial aid, so-called merit aid. And the reason there is that for many kids, and this goes back to something Matt said about enrollment trends, for many kids, it's not getting into college, it's having the money to pay for college. And if you offer kids admission without financial aid, because the financial aid is based on test scores, which are strongly related to socioeconomic status, you end up excluding them everywhere. Anyway, and we're very happy to see that systems like the University of California, Worcester Polytech, and others are now going to complete test optional or test blind by eliminating test scores from the financial aid decision-making process. That's the next frontier.
Okay, Matt, 2 minutes for you.
Yeah, I hit on this earlier a little bit. The schools are just doing a terrible job of this, and the students are suffering per usual from the school's lack of guidance. So they come out with this big sweeping policy and they say, we're going test optional, and then they don't really say what that means. I don't know in this context what optional means. It's like a teacher giving you optional homework or the option of doing extra credit. I don't understand how mandatory it is. And so, as I said, we have to sort of look to what they're doing, which is they're not really changing from historical practices. The UPenn Georgetown case I cited, wherein 75% of UPenn accepted students submitted test scores, 93% of Georgetown students submitted test scores. So they're saying one thing in public, doing a completely other thing behind doors. And then they're even having dissension within their own ranks in terms of messaging. And you get the UPenn faculty member saying test optional policy benefits a university's brand first and foremost, not students, because it's truthful and privileges those who are already privileged. Test optional will always mean test preferred. You have Lee Coffin of Dartmouth, Vice Provost for Enrollment, Dean of Admissions, saying, I don't want to admit someone who's going to struggle, specifically with regards to looking at these tests. So we're not really seeing any consistency. We're seeing a lot of opaque policies, and you're in a situation where the students are now going to face a much more competitive pool, because those who do submit scores will not have decreased, and there's going to be fewer seats for them. So there's going to be more competition there. Those who will not submit scores is going to be a massive new insurge of students, and they're only going to accept a very small percentage of those. So that's going to be a hyper-competitive class. And in all cases, students have no messaging or understanding of what's expected from them. And then the post hoc ergo propter hoc critique.
That's 10 minutes. That's
all right.
2 minutes. I throw it back to Bob, and then it'll be back to you. Bob?
Once again, Matt cherry picks a single quote. But so that quote from somebody who might have been affiliated with UPenn, where I believe the statistics were from early admissions, overrides the 560 admissions officers who signed with their names in a public document saying that applicants will neither be advantaged nor disadvantaged by submitting test optional. It's just very selective argument. We have an overwhelming number of professionals who say one thing, and Matt can find lots of quotes, 5, 10 here, 1 or 2 there, that goes the other way. It's not equivalent. I mean, there is a flat earth society. There are people who believe that COVID-19 is a fraud. They are wrong. They have reports that they can cite, but it doesn't make it true. The lived experience of colleges that has gone test optional show that it increases applicants, it improves the academic quality, and it enhances diversity of all sorts.
Okay.
Period.
Matt?
Yeah, I got lost somewhere around COVID, but the post hoc ergo propter hoc critique that Bob is making is this argument that just because things happen one after another, they must be causal, which is not at all the case. But it is an argument that he uses to prove that the UC system must have done everything right. And to your critique about using, cherry-picked quotes, I use quotes to illustrate viewpoints and to show points of view. But I started with 10 years of peer-reviewed research that have been repeatedly cited. So I reject this notion that I'm sort of cherry-picking. There's such a deep body of peer-reviewed research, not books, not op-eds, not signatures by people saying that students will be neither advantaged nor disadvantaged, which is like we can neither confirm nor deny the presence of test scores. It's just another meaningless platitude by the schools to try and make themselves look more attractive.
Okay, the next question, starting with Matt. I think both of you have raised financial aid issues, so maybe we should hit it squarely. How does financial aid, and particularly merit-based financial aid, figure in the test optional debate?
Yeah, I don't think merit-based aid should be tied to test scores at all. And I don't think that's an appropriate way to go about it. I think there's too many potentials for to go erroneous there. I think all aid should be need blind and need based. Colleges can fund that through their massive tax-free endowments, or the government can foot the bill because they seem to have figured out free college education in Argentina, Brazil, the Czech Republic, Egypt, Kenya, Malaysia, Turkey, the UK, Uruguay, and most of Western European countries. So I reject the notion that we can't make that happen here.
Okay, Bob, you got up to 2 minutes.
I agree that what Matt describes is optimal. What I didn't say in my road to Damascus answer to your first question was that one of my other experiences was working for Fair Test, or I was contracted with by the U.S. Department of Justice as part of their Mississippi higher ed desegregation lawsuit to look at the use of test scores in awarding scholarships in the state universities. And what we found, you get lots of data when you have the federal government judiciary subpoenas. We found that the state had set test score requirements for so-called merit scholarships to go to the University of Mississippi at Oxford, the flagship, at such a level that there was exactly one African-American child in the entire state who met that level. And that child was recruited by Duke, et cetera. So they used test scores tied to merit aid, so-called merit aid, as a way to maintain a dual system of education, AKA segregation.
Okay, Matt, 1 minute.
Yeah, not a lot of coherence there. Something happened a long time ago, and then somehow co-opting segregation into the test prep debate. I don't think it belongs here.
I'm even not sure what happened a long time ago. You cite research from 20 years ago. That's okay, but other people cite. Look, Matt, you have a libertarian view of education. That's fine. You're entitled to it. You're in a minority. You're an outlier. Colleges are moving in their own directions, and it really doesn't matter much what you or other adherents of test promotion actually say. The world has moved forward.
Okay, we have a question from the audience, and this will go to Bob first for 2 minutes. Has test optional helped underrepresented minorities gain admissions to top schools?
So they say. Many of the so-called top schools only converted to test optional admissions in the last year or two. So there is not a lot of data. We do have data from places like that have done long-term studies like Bates, like Mount Holyoke, and others that show that, yes, it has helped add to the diversity of the classes. How much is due to test optional policies and how much is due to other things? The University of Chicago, when it went test optional, also increased outreach and financial aid, both of which are very important components. So it's somewhat difficult to say specifically what test optional procedures did. But in the reports that schools have put out this year, I mean, headline after headline has said most diverse class ever. And that seems to be the trend. It'll take a year or two before we see cross-cutting studies with data from lots of institutions.
Matt, 2 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of research that shows it doesn't help. I cited them when I began. I'll cite it again. Test optional movement at America's Selective Liberal Arts College was published in Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, which is a peer-reviewed journal, shows that underrepresented minority students have no statistical difference after a test optional policy. But there's, quite a few more. I'm so confused on Bob's last point about calling me a libertarian, which regardless, libertarians' tenet is freedom of choice. So you're the one sort of vying for the ability to choose between submitting and not submitting a score. But at any rate, you mentioned that there was not a lot of data for underrepresented minorities increase or decrease after colleges go test optional, and there's in fact a ton, and I'll send it to you afterward.
Well, I said exactly the opposite. I said all the initial reports indicate that test optional this past year increased representation of historically underrepresented minorities. And the study you keep citing, EPAA, Mr. Belasco, one of the lead authors, was in the test prep business, A, and B, that is a study that counted a school, at least one school, as test optional. That wasn't. So peer reviewed or not, it was wrong.
Matt, final word?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't, yeah, I can't get into the peer review thing. But the post hoc ergo propter hoc thing is funny because you're saying it looks like it's working because they're admitting their most diverse classes ever, right? But in addition to going test optional, they also made a huge push to admit a more diverse class. But you're choosing to suggest that it's the test optional part of that was the saving grace and was the factor that really tipped it, not all of the other efforts that they made.
Okay, well, that brings us to our closing statements. Matt got to open today, and so we'll reverse it. And each of our speakers will have 2 minutes to give us their final words. And we'll start, please, with Bob Schaeffer.
So can I have a screen share back again? I see, oh, I have it, good. So I wanted to talk about what happens next from Fair Test's perspective. Let me see if this will work again. Yes.
I'm seeing it.
Okay, good. Once burnt, always shy. What we see as the future is that many more institutions are going to extend their test optional policies. Schools like Tufts and Middlebury and Case Western Reserve have all explicitly said that they're doing a multi-year pilot, and they'll use the data from their own experience to determine whether to go forward. Based on past experiences with pilots, once you adopt test optional, the data proves that it's the way you should go forward. The studies, and I said these weren't complete, but it's only 1 year of data in many cases, show students without scores succeed academically at about the same level. The experiences of peer institutions, there is a competitive factor, I agree with that, lead schools to stay test optional. So do student demand and demographics. Everyone knows that the number of high school grads will be on the decline in coming years. That doesn't mean the ACT and SAT disappeared. Fair Test has never called for that, but they would kind of be more like fade to the background as a so-called subject test, which and the writing test were at one time. It may well be that some hyper-selective colleges reinstate those requirements. Georgetown already has. But most colleges and universities serving a vast majority of undergraduates in the US will not. And increasingly, we'll see schools decoupling financial aid from test scores. And I'd like to again conclude by thanking TPAPT and all of you, particularly for your patience with that. Still don't know what the problem was here because everything's now working fine, but technology. And urge you to contact Fair Test and to look at the material. It's all available for free on our website at fairtest.org. Thank you again.
Thank you, Bob. And now a final word from Matt.
Yeah, you heard a number of arguments today from my side, from Bob's side. You heard from him that schools have made a choice to go test optional. And they haven't. The vast majority were forced into it by COVID, removing the testing centers, not allowing students to test. You heard that it was better for students. I wish it were. I wish that something so simple as making a test optional could fix or even make a positive increase to some of these endemic disparities we have in the education system, but it doesn't, not per all of the peer-reviewed research that we have. You've heard the UC system was an exemplary case of diversity following test optional policies. The UC system was one of the most convoluted and confusing examples. They were sued and appealed and sued and appealed, test optional, test blind. No, wait, we're going to make our own test. No, wait, we're not looking at any tests. And then they have a diverse class, and somehow that's attributable to their test optional policy. It's not. But there's a real problem at stake, and that's that the US education system is failing catastrophically. And we need to do something about it. And we need to address it at socioeconomic levels and at all different levels of the grading system, from pre-K to kindergarten and all the way up. But as in most cases, less data is not going to be helpful in doing that. The SAT and ACT elimination will blind us to some of the alarms that are sounding that we really need to pay attention to.
Okay, thank you very much. And Kevin, that's it for me. Back to you.